would just love to see some of these lawmakers have to stand up in front of a group of 14-year-olds and say the things they think teachers should say. Like, go ahead, just teach a lesson. Go in there for 43 minutes, and I want you to stand and just do it. Like, show me that you know what it's like to educate 14-year-olds, because I think one mention of 6-7 would drive them right out of the building. You're listening to New Hampshire Has Issues, and I'm your host from the future, Liz Canada. So Lewis and I cover a lot in this episode. We're going to talk about students with disabilities, the phrase special education, IEPs, and IDEA, and EFAs. There are so many acronyms in this episode. And we're going to talk a little bit about open enrollment. When we recorded this episode, the bill about open enrollment, which made a lot of headlines, you might have heard of it, it was stopped. But knowing how New Hampshire State House works sometimes, I asked him if we could talk about it anyway, just in case it resurfaced. And spoiler alert, it did late last week in a committee of conference. For more information about committees of conference in general, make sure to subscribe to the new Substack for New Hampshire Has Issues, nhhasissues.substack.com. Okay, so open enrollment might sound really nice. I'm going to put that on the table. Families get to choose any public school in the state they want to go to. But when we think about how schools are funded in New Hampshire, which is heavily reliant on property taxes, and as you'll hear Lewis talk about how special education is funded, we start to just see a tip of the iceberg of issues with open enrollment. So there's a lot to cover here. And this coming Thursday, the legislature is taking their last votes of the biennium. And part of those votes is going to be about open enrollment. I've added many links into the episode notes for you, because as much as I would love to go into every single policy detail of open enrollment, of the different amendments, the different bills, there are people who are doing a lot better of a job at that. Make sure to check out those links to learn more about what is happening this coming Thursday. This podcast is generously sponsored by Seacoast Soils. Check out Seacoast Soils for the things that you need for your lawn and garden, because we are here in June, and what a delight that good weather is finally approaching. Thank you so much for listening. Welcome to New Hampshire Has Issues, the podcast that dares to ask who actually has choice with school choice. I am your host, Liz Canada, and my guest today is Dr. Louis Esposito, the Executive Director of ABLE New Hampshire. Hi, Louis. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Liz. No, it's a pleasure. I'm really excited for this. Thanks for inviting me and having this conversation.
I am so glad that you're here. You have been recommended to me by multiple people, actually, to come on the podcast.
Really?
You've gotten some recs. Yeah, I've been hearing about you for a while.
My street rep.
A lot of good cred out there.
That's good.
So, Louis, did you come to the podcast ready with a tagline?
Ooh, I did.
Okay.
I forgot it though. But I had it. I was like all clever about it last night.
Sometimes I don't come prepared at all.
All right, my tagline. Welcome to New Hampshire Has Issues, the podcast that dares to ask when schools can choose who doesn't get chosen.
That's really good. That is very clever. I am really excited about this conversation because I have been so curious about how things are working or not working, ? In New Hampshire, or what ideas lawmakers have in New Hampshire. And so you are the person to talk to.
Wow.
So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone that said I was the person to talk to, I guess.
Shout out to all of those folks who are, I imagine some are listeners, I would guess. So maybe we could start with, what is ABLE New Hampshire? You're the executive director. But what is that organization? What do you do?
ABLE New Hampshire, ABLE stands for Advocates Building Lasting Equality in New Hampshire. And we are a group of disability advocates that try to make systematic barriers go away for full inclusion for students and adults for people with disabilities. So what does that mean? We look at the systematic barriers that might be interrupting somebody from accessing their community and preventing further inclusion. So we'll talk about education, but we also focus a lot on transportation, a huge barrier for people with disabilities. How to, get to and from, not just to your medical appointments, which is what's usually covered under waivers, but how do you get to the store? How do you get to go hang out with your friends? How do you go,
Yeah.
to the, Canopy Lake Park on a weekend? What we all kind of take for granted, and New Hampshire does not have a robust public transportation system. So
We sure do not.
so we're exploring that. We also look at a lot of DEI work. Disability is oftentimes forgotten about in that conversation, but how could we have diversity, equity, and inclusion without disability? So we've been working on that, making sure that we are part of that conversation. Oral health care is another thing that we do a lot of. Medicaid was not covering oral health care, more like the basic, I won't say basic, but like hygiene and dental checks up until the New Hampshire Smiles program, which in the past my predecessor helped push through. And now we're trying to get more dentists to accept Medicaid, which is another huge barrier.
Yep.
But mental health, civic engagement, voting rights is another big thing. We're talking about a lot of absentee voting and a lot of voting restrictions. That is huge for our community. If you have chronic health condition, how do you get to the polls? And now so many new barriers that are in place. And one of the things we do a lot of is, with all these changes, and they're so complicated, right? Like, how do you keep track of them all? So we try to put things in like a plain language and just easy to understand information, because it's a complicated mess, right? And I think it's purposely complicated. So we try to put things in different perspective and really just promote people with disability having a voice in their communities, making sure that we're at the table for all the conversations, not just the ones that we're invited to. We want to kind of knock down the door and barge in.
Yeah. The complicated mess, that's the whole premise of this podcast, is that New Hampshire
Yes,
is a
that's
complicated
true.
mess, and we're creating more and more, feels
Yeah.
like. And there are folks who are trying to solve them, like yourself.
Mhm.
And I think that's really important to remember, is that there are great folks out there doing the work, trying to make things a little bit better in this complicated mess that we live in. So, Lewis, you work
Mhm.
to make education more inclusive, to support students and families, I imagine, the whole
Yeah.
gamut of individuals who are, encountering schools. Can you talk just a little bit about the type of work that you do when it comes to education?
So I'm a former teacher,
Ooh, me
first
too.
and foremost.
Okay.
Or what'd you teach?
I taught high school English.
Oh, awesome. I was a special, or they'll call it supportive education teacher. I started off as a paraprofessional. I jumped
Ugh,
into, yeah, you're
paraprofessionals. They are the ones who make the school function, everyone.
so
Paraprofessionals.
much,
Yeah,
so much. And they're so underappreciated and underfunded. And really, like, a special education teacher, they could only do so much. Paraprofessionals do so much of the work, and it goes unnoticed.
absolutely.
And such a key member of the team. But I supported kids in both an intellectual and developmental disability setting. I supported kids that had communication support needs and high-tech communication systems, and kind of more like behavioral students that, needed that extra support and a little extra love and attention. And, I loved it. And then I also worked for an emotional disability program, kids with anxiety, stress, depression, anger. It's called emotional disturbance. I hate that term, but that's what the label is. And, that was also eye-opening. So the whole other, almost like a whole different spectrum of special education. But we do a lot of work in education and at ABLE, and really we're trying to find student voices, but we're also finding voices of parents that are navigating this overly complex system that
Mm-hmm.
is not necessarily designed or built with disability in mind. Like, how many schools were built, before IDEA, which we'll get into, before that was created, before
Yeah.
ADA, 1990. Most of the schools in the
Yep.
state were built before this. So they were not built for disability in mind. And there are a lot of kids with disabilities, and it's a big umbrella. And, not every kid gets an IEP, but, there are a lot of students that just need extra support. So we focus a lot on, some of the policies that are going through the State House that might affect special education. A lot of them we have to keep track of are both special education specific and general education specific,
Right.
because every student is a general education student first, regardless if they're have an IEP. So we're kind of all over the place. So we work with a lot of different groups and coalitions to kind of focus on that. We push back on some of the policies. Like there was one this year on increasing restraint and seclusion in schools as a form of punishments. Like, wow, that's something we're going to have to actually worry about this year. Consolidating services within a region for special education, which we took as, oh my God, we're going to make many schools dedicated for special education and have many institutions. So we're staying focused, and we have to push back on some of the other bills that we might feel are dangerous. We had the open enrollment debacle going on, and we were a big voice in that. When they introduced that bill, it really wasn't intended to be a special education conversation, but it just took off. And, we were able to really primarily take up almost the whole second day of that hearing of just the voices of parents and people with disabilities talking about what this would do to special education.
So earlier, I
Mhm.
heard you sort of stop yourself. You had started saying that you had been a special education teacher, and then you stopped and you said, I
Yeah.
was a supportive educator of students. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because I think that is a topic that a lot of people don't hear about when we're talking about students with disabilities and schools.
I hate the word special used in that
Mm,
context. It really kind of others a lot of students. And I know it's a term that's used a lot by, a lot of different areas in the disability world. And there's a lot of mixed views of it. Special Olympics is a huge part of a lot of people's lives, and New
right.
Hampshire history, really. But, the way I like to view it, what makes someone's needs more special than others, right? I have needs. My students have needs. Students that might not have a disability have needs. Why is one group categorized as special and then another? I mean, like, think about it for a second. Like, special usually means like extra or on top of or just extraordinary, right? And we're seeing costs for special education rise all over the place. So when you hear those words, it's like, are these actual services and supports that we actually need? Or, why do we need to do this? But when we start saying the word supportive, it kind of has a different meaning. Like, I think all students could benefit from supportive education in some way. And I think that's where it gets lost in the conversation. Like someone's needs, they might need it for a year or two. Someone might need extra support just for the day or a couple days, But, we categorize this one group by using that term that it kind of, others. And you hear it too. Like when I was a teacher, I'm sure you heard it too. Like, oh, like the SPED students. I'm a SPED student. This is
Yep.
my belief. And,
Yep.
I did a lot of research on essentially just identity creation and how using those terms really impact someone's understanding of disability. It really kind of focuses more on the fact that there's a deficit and there's something wrong and needs to be improved. Like even the whole system as a whole, right? Like it's really shaped almost like you're diagnosing somebody and trying to cure them of a disability, right? Like you have a meeting, and you've probably been to, special education meetings before. You have the whole team that sits around, and maybe the student's
Mm-hmm.
there, maybe they're not, and we're going to go over all your goals, and we're going to re-diagnose you every 3 years, and we're going to have a treatment plan for you to get the services that you need. And it just feels kind of icky and gross. And I would love to see some movements to change it. Right now, we're really in defense mode, but I think long term, I'd love to, kind of reshape how, we not just view supportive education, but how we, utilize it too. So I guess I do push back on that word. I do like calling it supportive, and I hope people, do catch on to that.
And I think for the listener, this is not a feel panicked if you say it because you're trying to move.
Yeah.
It's just it's an education and awareness. We're always trying to learn a little bit more and
Yeah.
become better aware. And so we might say special education in this episode because that is the term that is used so often. But to keep that awareness in general here and beyond this little episode.
Yeah, and just challenge, it's good to challenge yourself with these things and challenge others
Yeah.
too. And, and then you start having a conversation about the whys behind it, which is so important too.
So you mentioned IEP meetings,
Hmm.
and myself having been a former educator, I am aware of what those are. But maybe you could talk a little bit more, because I imagine that there are some listeners who
Yeah.
have had the experience of themselves being in an IEP meeting, or for a child or a family member. But let's just start simple. What is an IEP? What does it actually mean? And who does it
Yeah.
actually cover? What does it actually do?
An IEP is an individualized education program. an IEP supports a student in their academic progress that has a disability. And there are, I think, 14 to 15, I'm sorry about that, but categories that a student in New Hampshire could be categorized with an IEP. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what they are because, there's also like that whole 504 conversation, right?
Yep.
Like there are a lot of students with IEPs that have a 504. They don't, what distinguishes between the two of them, an IEP, you require services for the support, while a 504 is just support or accommodations essentially. So the services are going to be, your special education teacher helping you with reading, writing, math. You're having OT, speech, PT based off of the goals and the diagnostic criteria that you were given for the diagnosis. But they're stressful and they're overwhelming.
Yeah. For everybody in the room, they're stressful. Every single
Everybody.
person. Yeah.
Everybody. I've been in some that were just amazing meetings and you feel good afterwards. And then others that were battles and others that, people are crying. It's like you kind of know before you're going in which direction it's going to be in from the teacher lens. But I mean, they're tough. And I don't think, they're designed to support the student and understand the needs and have a team-based conversation. But a lot of families out there don't feel like the team is working for them. That they're kind of working against, and it comes to this kind of combative nature where you're kind of duking it out over what you feel is the best need for your kid in both ways. I've been on both sides where, I was helping parents like, no, like we want these type of supports in it. And they're like, no, we don't need them. And then the other way, like, well, I don't think you need them anymore. Like, well, no, we absolutely do. So it is it's challenging and it's very legalese. And,
Yeah.
there's a lot of compliance that comes with it. And, and there's reasons for that. There's lawsuits, there's due process. And, there's a lot of conversations that could stem afterwards that could be very challenging too, and including, significant financial, cost to the school district if they're not done correctly. So they are complicated, but in a nutshell, it provides the support and services that a student needs to achieve academically in the least restrictive environment. But even now, we call it least restrictive. Why don't we call it the most inclusive environment, right? Like, just the terminology that we use is perplexing sometimes.
What are some tangible examples of the types of supports that might be in an IEP for a student?
When I was supporting kids with emotional disabilities, a good emotional support. So a student would be really frustrated or anxious about a test, right? And we would provide them, conversations where we would to help teach them the skills so that they could not overcome, but, kind of work through that anxiety so that they could persevere. Other services would be, speech and language. You might get that for like 30 minutes a week where you're learning to, articulate things and improve your communication skills so that you could, not get so frustrated when you're in the social environment at recess, so you're working on skills. So it's the direct instruction that you get. That's really important.
You also mentioned IDEA. Do you want to talk a little bit about that too? And I say that because in an episode that I had with Patricia Vincent-Piet, it was about the Americans with Disabilities Act. We talked about that.
She's amazing.
And that being, she's amazing. She's so good. Pat, I know you're listening. We love you. So what is IDEA? So we talked about ADA as being sort of like these protections overall in our society and certain, housing and so forth. What is IDEA, that acronym?
Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Think of it this way. This started in 1975. What were the major political movements going on at that time period? We had the civil rights movement in the 60s, right? 50s into 60s. We had the women's rights movement, kind of peaking up in the 60s, 70s. And, disability rights is right there. It's like most things, they don't happen in a vacuum. And this was the foundational law that provided support and education for students with disabilities. Before they were not, you didn't have to educate students with disabilities in a public school. Sometimes they would go to a separate school, or sometimes they weren't allowed in the school at all. Like imagine if you're a wheelchair user and that school wasn't built, how would you supposed to get into the classroom? Like they didn't have to do that back then. So this was a foundational law. There's a lot to improve on, but a foundational law that in the civil rights of people with disabilities. It's been around for 51 years now. IDEA is plain and simple. It provides everyone with an education. It's a civil rights issue.
All right, so I feel like we've hit some of the terminology around schools and students with disabilities. So here in New Hampshire, how many students are we talking about across the state?
Probably more than people realize. About 20% of students.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, it's large, and it's expensive too. It's a giant portion, but the support and services really there's a huge range of needs and support needs that students in New Hampshire have. So 20%, you might not realize it. Your best friend might have had an IEP when they were younger, or your neighbor's kid might have an IEP now. I think there's more kids that have IEPs, but there's that stigma behind it, right? Like disability, oftentimes, I'm sure Pat talked about it too. There's still a stigma with disability where people aren't necessarily as open as they should be about it, and kind of owning that like disability piece as part of your identity. But a considerable portion of the students in New Hampshire have one.
So what's the state's responsibility when it comes to educating students who have IEPs or students who have disabilities? Like, what's New Hampshire, the state's responsibility?
About $3,000. Not much. I mean, there needs to be more.
$3,000. Boy, oh boy.
Yeah.
That's a
Boom,
very
boom.
small amount.
I mean,
Yikes.
yes, there's the state's responsibility, but let's backtrack it a little bit. It's the federal responsibility first. This is a federal law. The federal government promised that IDEA would be funded 40% right off the bat. It's at 13.
So the federal government said we are going to make sure 40% of this is covered for states, for students, and what they've actually contributed is 13%.
What we're at right now is 13, yeah. I don't have the numbers long term, but when it was first signed, that was the intention to grow into it, and we have not come close to that number.
Wow.
So like everything, it falls to the state next. And, when you look at some of those conversations we had this year about adequacy and what education looks like, mysteriously, special education was not necessarily part of that dialogue. An adequate education should require adequate supports, right? So the state will, as part of the per student expenditure, whatever the formula is, but they do give school districts an additional, a couple $1,000s. I think it's 2.7 or $3,000 around there to support kids with disabilities. But for the most part, about 80-something% of it falls back to the towns. And that's where you start seeing a lot of these issues popping up now, where budgets are astronomical and it's not sustainable, where the numbers, because the needs are increasing, the lack of teachers, the lack of support paraprofessionals, related services, they're fewer and fewer in between. And towns are struggling right now. They're hiring separate organizations to fulfill these roles because it's a legal requirement. It is not negotiable. What's in the IEP is a document that is a promise, and you have to provide it. And it's not supposed to be based off of, available funds either. So, it's about what the kid needs, first and foremost. Go back to the civil rights conversation, right? The state needs to pay their fair share, but I think we also need to make sure that we're criticizing our federal response too. Like they need to pay their fair share as well. They have not done so. And it's really fallen back on the towns who are struggling to come up for air with all the weight of the financial burden it has.
So the federal government has shifted this down on the states. The state of New Hampshire provides public school districts about $3,000 per student who has an IEP. Is that correct?
It's about $5,000 for every student, regardless, and an additional around $3,000 for a student with an IEP.
Right. Flashback to Zach Sheehan's episode about why school funding is not fair yet. There's the adequacy aid, there's the base aid, but then special education has an additional $3,000 per year for the student. And even just based on what we've talked about so far, we can already say $3,000 is not cutting it in terms of covering what needs to be done. And so the rest is shifted down to the towns and the cities who then have to cover the difference for that student.
So there is a thing, they used to call it catastrophic aid. Going back to that conversation about special education, right? Like now we're going to call it someone's needs catastrophic. But if the expense gets to a certain level, the state does provide additional funds, but that's from a giant pool of money that everybody has to pick from. So you might not get as much as you were intended to, or as much as you need for certain individuals. So the goal of that is to not have somebody come into your school district and just completely obliterate, your school budget. But it's still happening, and it's very dangerous.
With all of that context, what is going on when it comes to quote unquote school choice? And school choice can encompass a lot. You can choose to go to a private school. You could choose to go to a religious private school. You can choose to go to a charter school, which are public schools. You can choose to go to your local public school. And the legislature was just chit-chatting about maybe choosing any school you want to in the state, but we'll get to that in a minute. But when it comes to school choice, how does that bump up against what the needs are for students with disabilities, or how does it all work for students?
It doesn't. So, and I guess that's why New Hampshire's a mess with this. But specifically for disability, if you received an EFA voucher, let's just call it what it is, a voucher, you essentially waive your rights. So if you want to take that to a private school, that voucher, that private school does not have to provide the support that kid might get at a public school. So,
Louis, can you say that again? Hit me with that one more time, because I think what I just heard you say is that if you get an EFA and you send your kiddo to a private school, the private school is not required to do the things from the IEP.
Correct. Yeah, they're not required to do it at all. But let's just talk, like we're saying, but who's using the EFA, right? A student that might have a learning disability, or, someone that might not be as has the significant functional needs that other students have. But, they might have a learning disability and they go to that private school. They will not get the support from that private school. If you use those funds for a home-based program, you actually get additional funds. That comes back to that number again. Yep. And this is actually interesting. It's called a disabling condition. So you actually get additional funds for EFA vouchers if you have a disabling condition. But that disabling condition doesn't necessarily mean you get an IEP or you qualify for an IEP. It could be any disability, or it could be a doctor's note saying you have a disabling condition, anxiety, something. You get those additional funds. So the criteria to get that additional funds is actually less than what you would need to get at the public school. So we're sending a lot of additional funds out there for kids that might not be getting those funds if they were going to the public school. But essentially, when you sign up for the EFA, you waive your right to have an IEP. The school district is no longer required to provide that additional support to you.
And to flash back to earlier in our conversation, an IEP is a legal document. If a public school has a student who has an IEP, they are legally required to comply and follow the IEP and provide what is necessary for that student to learn based on what is in that IEP. So if a family decides to, quote unquote, choose to go to a private school and gets an education freedom account, one of those vouchers, they waive their right. They lose that right for their IEP to be implemented, to make sure that the new school they're choosing actually provides what their student needs.
Something,
boy, oh boy.
And that's just something. EFAs, right? And I don't agree with EFAs, but I think there are a lot of families out there that are just really especially families of kids with disabilities, they're really frustrated by the system. It's driven by paperwork, and you feel like these decisions are made without you. So, I have had parents connect with me where they like that program, but it's for the different reasons that you would think. They could use those funds for the additional supports that they wouldn't be getting at the school, but it wouldn't necessarily cover all the educational needs that a kid would have. That's the other end of it. If the student needs speech and language and OT and, a reading specialist, there's no way that those funds are going to cover all those expenses for a full year. So it is not necessarily a system that a lot of people with disabilities I've heard use it. And that's just for low support needs. If you have high support needs, like a kid that might need, a one-to-one all day with nursing support and whatnot, there's no way the funds for an EFA would ever approach what that kid actually would benefit from.
You mentioned the frustrations that families can sometimes feel in their public schools. That has been an argument made by the folks who support EFAs.
Yeah.
Is that bearing out in reality? Are we seeing families leaving their public schools to go to a private school
Not in the significant numbers that, warrant the drastic amount of money that's being flooded into the system. No.
Hmm.
And I'd be kind of curious, there's hasn't been a lot of data coming out about the EFAs. I'd be kind of curious to see how much is being given this extra disabling condition part and how many kids with disabilities are leaving public education. And does it seem like there's a lot with the data that's been out there now, but I don't know how many specific with disabilities are leaving public schools. And it's not a large portion by any means.
And that's been a lot of money that they've put towards the EFA's education freedom accounts over the past 2 years as well.
And growing.
And growing. Indeed, indeed. Well, the other big topic that's come up is the open enrollment bill, but the policy. And we're recording this on May 4th, Star Wars Day, May 4th, 2026.
Oh, that's right.
The bill stalled out, at least this version of the bill stalled out in the House. However, longtime listeners of the show will know, nothing is ever over until it's actually over. So it's not gone, and the State House is still happening for another month. So before we say it's totally done, what was it? What's this open enrollment debate actually about? And how did you see your work intersecting with this issue?
I mean, open enrollment was a disaster in so many different levels. From a disability specific level, there's a lot of different issues that could pop up, right? The resident school district is responsible, right? So theoretically, a student could have transportation as part of their IEP because they can't access the regular education bus. Now, all of a sudden, that school district might have to transport that student 30, 40 minutes, according to where, a parent would want to go. What happens to those supports? The school resident district needs to still provide those supports, but now they're being delivered at a different school. So you have now two teachers, one the resident and one at the new school, would need to provide those supports. Who pays for the related services, the speech, OT, paraprofessionals, and if they don't have them, contracted services. So there's just so many issues, and I think it really would have just skyrocketed even more some of the costs that we're seeing with special education budgets. Where we played a role is a lot of advocates came out and spoke up about this. The other really interesting piece that we stumbled upon, it was really the first day of the hearing, it was like 4 hours. And I don't know if Liz, if you've been in that room before, it's hot as hell in there.
Oh, I've been in there. It's toasty.
That hearing went on forever, but it gave me kind of a chance. And there was a person from the Reason Foundation that popped up on there. And, so I did some exploring and I'm like, oh, wow, like they are a think tank for, pro-choice schools. And so I started exploring, and in their documents, they kind of laid it out there that most of the schools and most of the states that had open enrollment, were having a hard time with supporting kids with disabilities because they were actually being excluded from these programs. And some of the research that I found, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, huge proportions of students with disabilities were being excluded from open enrollment choices. And that's because of two factors. One, in their states, it's a little bit different than ours, but they had like what's called like capacity. So you would have like open enrollment slots, but they had them specifically for students with IEPs. So they could only take X amount of students with an IEP this year. And there are some districts that would just put the mark at zero in some of these other states. And then you throw in 504s. Now, those could also be expensive. We're talking full-blown FM communication systems, potential transportation. And these are remember from before, accommodations, right? For a student to access their general education. And those could be very expensive. And that's actually the responsibility of the receiving school because they're not under IDEA. So now you have a school that would be on the hook for really expensive costs. So if we're treating, and that was one of the arguments, right? Like, schools need to be more run like a business. We're going to treat this like it's a thriving business. Schools are going to excel at certain areas and the good ones are going to thrive and the bad ones are going to fall apart. Well, if you treat it like a business, which students do you think get cut out first? The ones that are most expensive, right? And, it's very clear that that's what's happening in other states. Colorado has a civil rights action lawsuit based off their open enrollment programs for kids with disabilities. And those are just the 3 states that actually track data, which is the other insane part of all this. They're the ones that actually track whether or not a student was denied open enrollment because of their disability. All the other ones, it's there. It's just not there's no data to support it. So this open enrollment, it really started causing, they rewrote it a couple times. Initially it was going to be funded primarily and only through the residential school. Then it was going to be funded similarly to like a charter school model from the state. But eventually where it started getting really convoluted, and you can see all the different terms they added for special education. And if you look at Senator Lang, when he initially introduced the bill, he said, I don't want to turn this into a giant talk about special education, but he couldn't answer a basic question about 504. And then that conversation turned into a giant talk about special education. And they didn't have a lot of answers. I mean, they didn't even contact the special education administrators. The DOE didn't have the appropriate answers either, which they were, sitting alongside Lang in that first hearing. And person after person kind of started breaking down, what this would actually mean for students with disabilities. And it's really hard when somebody pushes back on that because they sound so ignorant. And I think they said it like that in a lot of areas. But with disability, for some reason, it just kind of sticks out more. Like, what we started hearing things like, well, what about the other kids? Or what about the other students? So then it just makes you sound horrible, right? And so it got interesting. And I'm not sure if that was the force behind, why it was, voted down. There are a lot of reasons why it was voted down. And there's a lot of great people out there that were producing some great advocacy work, Reaching Higher, Fair Funding Project, and doing some tremendous work. And a lot of advocates all over the state in various areas were coming together for this thing. I mean, if you look at the numbers, it was like 2,700 people opposed online to 70 people supporting. So the numbers weren't there. And then you throw in the local towns. A lot of them were also voting about their open enrollment within the local area. So this law would supersede that, which I know upset a lot of people. So at the end of the day, about 20 representatives either decided not to vote or vote against it, which was, I was surprised, but very excited. It's not dead yet, like you said, and things could just kind of mysteriously pop back up. So we're keeping an eye on it. But I'll be curious if there's any other plans that pop out. I'm sure there will be soon, but we'll be ready to kind of push back on that when it happens.
Because the open enrollment policy, the premise was that a student and a family could choose any school in the state that they wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
There were some nuances, but at the end of the day, the idea of this policy is the enrollment across the state is just open. You don't have to just go to the school where you live.
Mm-hmm.
You can go anywhere you want to any of the public schools. And as you're saying, so I'm hearing you say, there are significant issues in terms of fairness and making sure that students with disabilities wouldn't be left out. Because if schools could decide how many, then it comes down to how much might it cost to cover the supports needed for those students to be educated.
Students shouldn't be viewed as dollar signs.
Yeah.
And in this case, they absolutely would have. And yeah, I mean, like Exeter to Concord, Exeter to Keene, like there was no real restrictions on it. I think primarily it's still like, from an equity perspective, you still have to provide your own transportation. So who does that help out? If someone lives in Nashua and they want to go to Amherst, there's certain families that could afford to take the time to drive in the morning and pick up in the afternoon. Like it's just not equitable. So I think it was another way to kind of further segregate and further, kind of tear apart public education.
There are issues still in public schools. Like things are not perfect. I do not want to pretend as if things are perfect in public schools across New Hampshire when it comes to supporting students with disabilities. What has been your experience working with or next to school districts in New Hampshire?
I don't think schools are working for all students right now. I don't think the solution to the plans are destroying public education. I think we do have to get creative and have a better roadmap on how to improve them. And improvement of them can't be just as simple as more money. It can't be, we're going to have more choice and vouchers and all this other nonsense. I don't feel like education is working necessarily the way it's supposed to. And, even before the Free Staters have come in and started with these plans, I don't think it was necessarily working. So I think, us just saying, throwing our hands up, we need more funds is not the solution. We need to come up with some complicated answers pretty quickly and a roadmap on how to get there. And, I think that's where we're struggling, because there's a lot of educators right now that could give their perspective on how to improve things, and a lot of professionals and scholars out there that could really give some insight, but we're not really listening to them as much. I don't know how many people on the House Education Policy Committee were former teachers or scholars of this field, but it's not many. But I could get off my soapbox, but
No, I think you're right that there's not a lot of former teachers on that committee. And
it's a handful.
It feels to me, seems like our state lawmakers are trying to strangle education and try to tighten their grip on it, when it feels like the opposite needs to happen. There needs to be room and encouragement for innovation. Let's think creatively. We don't need to encourage students to leave. The story that always jumps out to me is teaching the yellow wallpaper, because students really never knew what to expect from that specific story.
Yeah.
And I won't spoil it for you, but it's a good one.
I'm going to have to read that one.
It's very good.